Joseph Abbeel's memoir offers a riveting glimpse into the life of a Flemish light horseman conscripted into Napoleon's Grand Army. His vivid recounting of the Napoleonic Wars, from personal hardships to battlefield experiences, highlights the resilience and humanity of a soldier amid the era's epic turmoil. Let's begin. On September 7, 1806, I was summoned at 10 o'clock in the morning in Ghent. The following day, I went to the department office, where I requested and received a delay of 8 days, so I had time to find a young man who would be willing to serve in my place. I brought him before the committee, which rejected him on an insignificant ailment, just like the next candidate. I then decided to try my luck myself, realizing that this start did not bode well. Without further effort, I went to the Augustinian monastery, where the unfortunate conscripts were housed. Upon arrival, the door was shut behind me, and I was escorted by a sentry to the church of the monastery. In the church, there was shouting and cursing, which seemed very strange to me, as I had never heard or seen anything like it. At night, we did not have a moment of rest due to the noise made in the destruction of altars, doors, and windows. The entire inventory was broken down or smashed. It was painful to witness this wanton desecration. Eventually, I had to resign myself to the fact that everyone was henceforth a free thinker, and on Friday I ate meat just like the others. This shows that one quickly adapts to the pigs with whom one is in the forest. On the 8th day of our stay there, we were inspected by a general of the recruitment, who selected me and a certain parent from Zelzati for the 20th Regiment of Carabinier, about which he spoke highly. According to him, we were much better off than others waiting for their destination. We left the same day under the command of an old sergeant who had even been in Egypt, along with a certain Slabert from Kalkin and Goemine from Steenhausen, both destined for the 10th Regiment of Cuirassiers. We were all as proud as peacocks. In the evening upon our arrival in Aalst, I thought about deserting because I had ended up in a poor inn where I received no food. However, an acquaintance I met on the street advised me against it. From Aalst, we moved on to Brussels, Genappe, Namur, Dinant, Givet, Fumay, Rocroi, Charleville-Mézières, Sedan, Stenay, Pont-à-Mousson, Nancy, and Lunéville, where our regiment's depot was located. Upon our arrival, we were immediately sent to the barracks, which were located in the palace of Stanislas II, the former king of Poland. To our surprise, we were the smallest of the group. The next day, we received uniforms and learned to exercise on foot and on horseback, and so forth, until we could finally stand guard. On the 4th day after my arrival, I had my first altercation with a certain Bonaire. Although he had only been there for 8 or 10 days, he had the audacity to call me a conscript. We exchanged words, and he challenged me to a duel. Without showing fear, though I was afraid, I took a saber, walked outside, and told him to follow me. Realizing that I had walked outside fearlessly and because he didn't know whether I could fence or not, which was also my biggest concern, he closed the door behind me and left me standing outside. Laughing, he said it was just to test me. The others who had remained in the room gave the coward several slaps and let me inside. I was glad that our dispute ended this way, for I had never wielded a saber before. While I was on guard a few days later, a certain Drouet told me that a new Fleming had arrived in our dormitory, who had asked about me. "I think he's a replacement," said Drouet, "because he has a lot of money, wears silver shoe buckles, and has a gold and silver watch. Yes, I believe," he continued, "that he is a big spendthrift, because he had barely arrived in the room when he already had 2 large jugs of wine brought in." I asked him to bring the man to the guardroom, which he did. After we had talked for a while, he asked me to go with him to the tavern next to the guardhouse. Soon we were there with 10, 12 Flemings together, whom he generously treated. The next day when I came back from guard duty, he asked if he could sleep with me. I agreed on the condition that he also ask my roommate Drouet. He did, and he gave Drouet 6 francs to change beds. From that moment, I had to go to the tavern daily, against my will, to help squander his money. When I told him that his money would soon run out this way, he replied that he could get as much money as he wanted. And so we lived like fish in water, and before 2 months were over, he had spent 300 guilders and everything he owned. And that doesn't even count what he had already spent on his journey from Turnhout to Lunéville. When the money was gone, we asked for a new sum by letter, and his family sent him another 300 guilders, which was spent less quickly. I had advised him not to treat everyone so generously. This man, named Vloers, the only son of the widow of a lawyer from Turnhout, absolutely wanted to join the army, despite the rich inheritance that awaited him, as we will see later in this document. Meanwhile, since we had some experience in riding and weaponry, we were ordered in early February 1807 to prepare for a march. Under the command of Lieutenant Mathieu, we left Luneville on February 20th with a detachment of 300 poorly trained conscripts to join our regiment in the field in Germany. We had barely been on the road toward Haguenau for half an hour when my horse fell, with me underneath. Fortunately, I wasn't hurt. It was my fault because I had tightened the girth too much. After the horse had lain on the ground for a while, it got up, unharmed. Nonetheless, as punishment, I had to carry my saddlebag myself and lead the animal by hand for 14 days. That cost me a lot of sweat, as I had to follow the others who were riding. Upon our arrival in Haguenau, we joined a detachment of cuirassiers from the 10th Regiment, including Slabert and Goemine, whom we had already met in this account. We traveled together through Landau, Speyer, Mainz, Frankfurt, and many more cities, counties, and duchies, too numerous to mention. Eventually, we found the regiment near the town of Freienwalde. When we arrived, the old soldiers took our beautiful young horses, and we received their old ones in return, without us being able to object, as that was the custom. During our stay there, we became more and more skilled in weaponry and riding until we moved to East Prussia. After winning that land, we returned to Marienwerder, where we stayed until the beginning of winter. From there, we rode to Poland, where we suffered great poverty until we advanced to fight against the Russians. We did not participate in the Battle of Eylau because we arrived too late. We were placed in the vanguard of our corps to fight at Friedland. On the way there, on an evening when it was raining heavily and therefore dark, we arrived at a forest where the enemy was spending the night. To avoid drawing attention, we were forced to dismount and spend the night holding the reins, without speaking a word. At dawn, we were forced to retreat because of the potato balls, cannonballs, that fell in large numbers among our ranks. Having reached the vicinity of Eylau, we spent the night near a chapel about half an hour's walk from the town. At this location, the Russians had offered the fiercest resistance during the previous campaign. I fetched a large copper kettle from a cottage to cook soup. Only later did we notice that the kettle was rusty. Hardly had we eaten the soup when our entire group became deathly ill. Fortunately, a fire was still burning, and there was a pot of lukewarm water ready, intended for making porridge. We drank this water until we could vomit like ripe plums. As soon as we vomited, we felt better. The next morning at 4 o'clock, we left our bivouac and shortly after, having ridden through a forest for a while, we arrived on a plain near Friedland, where the Russians were arrayed in battle formation. Just as the staff of our regiment emerged from the forest, the leg of a certain Smet, a German from the 1st Company, was shot off. He died on the spot. We immediately set off at a gallop to form our ranks and then waited in the sight of the enemy until our infantry and other units arrived. While we stood there in battle formation, we were continuously shot at by the enemy. Many of our men were killed, but we were not yet ordered to attack. Repeatedly, we asked Colonel Blancard for permission to charge, but he replied that he would let us fight when the time was right. In the meantime, he forbade us from ducking under a bullet or cannonball if we saw or heard one coming. He set a good example himself. Although many men fell around him, he sat upright on his horse with folded arms, as relaxed as someone sitting at a feast table. While we remained standing there, other regiments arrived and formed up in battle formation. Finally, we received what we had asked for, and the command was given to attack the enemy. In a moment, everyone was in motion, and by evening, we had driven the Russians away and captured the battlefield and the town. Many were killed or wounded on both sides, but especially on the Russian side. The enemy had broken the bridge over the river behind the battlefield to prevent the French army from cutting them off from that side. Therefore, the enemy could not retreat across the river and was forced to surrender or fight to the death. Since the Russians were eventually forced to retreat, they had to cross the river at a ford. Thus, thousands of soldiers who had escaped the danger of the battlefield drowned that day. The river was full of horses, cannons, munition wagons, baggage, and dead bodies. I lost my horse that day, which was hit by a cannonball in the head. As I walked away from the horse, I myself was hit by a bullet that went through my arm. Our army pursued the enemy, but I stayed behind with other wounded and horseless riders in a village near the battlefield. One morning, we went with a group of riders to find the peasants who had hidden in the forests. They had abandoned their homes and taken everything they owned, so there was nothing left for us to take. When we found peasants, we robbed them of everything they had taken with them. That same afternoon, 3 of us commandeered a farmer's wagon and 2 horses we had also found to get grass for the wounded horses. When we reached this village, about an hour and a half from our bivouac, we tied our horses to the gate of the first house. We entered the home, looking for the milk we had seen in passing that morning when we had searched all the houses without seeing any inhabitants. Now we found some peasants in the house, to whom we asked for milk, but they denied having any. One of my comrades, named Porcelli, went into a room and came back with a jug of milk, which we drank. Meanwhile, several peasants had arrived in the yard and had already untied our horses to drive them away. Fortunately, my two companions just then walked outside and saw this. They ran up to them and pulled the reins out of their hands. Amid the tumult, I also walked outside. In the courtyard, I met a peasant who was considerably taller than I was. He asked me what we were doing there. I replied that we had only come to drink milk. Then it's all right, he said. I walked calmly to the wagon, not showing that I was scared. It did not look good though, for under his vest, with folded arms, he held two loaded pistols which he fired at us as soon as we were on the wagon. We whipped the horses to make them run as fast as possible. While passing a barn, peasants waiting for us there fired more than 100 shots at us. Fortunately, they hit neither us nor the horses. The furious peasants continued to chase us for a long time. They shouted that we had already robbed them of everything they had taken with them in the forests, and now we also wanted their homes if we could catch them. They were so enraged that they would probably have skinned us if they could have done so easily before we were on the wagon. But, we decided, they were probably too afraid that we would come to the village with more soldiers. When we arrived at the bivouac, we recounted our adventures to the others. The next day, we went armed to the village, looted it, and set it on fire, without seeing a single peasant there. Several days later, we rejoined the regiment. We found it on the road to Tilsit, and together we headed toward that town. As we approached Tilsit, we learned that peace had been declared, or was about to be. Soon we were ordered to retrace our steps and take up residence in a town in a region that had not yet been plundered. This order was received with great joy. Everywhere, the cry of Vive l'Empereur resonated. It was not surprising that everyone was delighted to rest, as we had been staying in this poor Poland for 6 or 7 months by then. Our horses had been fed nothing but old straw that we pulled off the roofs of houses and barns for over 3 months, making the animals very thin and weak. And I haven't even mentioned our food yet, as we often went 5 or 6 days without bread. The reader will understand all this better when he reads the description of this unfortunate and ruined country later in this report. After a few weeks in the place where we were quartered, a shortage of almost everything began to arise. Therefore, we moved to the island of Nogat, one of the best regions of Prussia. In groups of 20 to 30 men, we were housed in farmhouses. The barns and houses were well supplied with food for both humans and animals, as it was the end of August and the harvest had just been brought in. We lived there carefree for 2 months, but then even there everything had been eaten and consumed. A soldier returning from a campaign wastes more than he uses sensibly. After we had devoured everything, we left that region ruined. More than half of the regiment fell ill, and several soldiers died. Perhaps the cause was our licentious life or the unhealthy air. This island was, after all, dotted with swamps, somewhat like our polders at home. Or was it due to the unhealthy food we had eaten during the campaign? From there, we set off toward Berlin, without knowing where we would stop. On the first day of this journey, I was on guard by the baggage wagons when suddenly I felt a chill and also had such a severe bout of diarrhea that I did not have time to dismount from my horse. In an instant, I soiled my long trousers and boots. When I arrived at the company in the evening, I was assigned lodging with the rest of my roommates, the group of soldiers I shared a room with in the barracks. Out of embarrassment for my roommates, however, I dared not enter their home. I tied my horse in the barn and lay shivering with cold on some straw. The next day, a certain Boyan from Sint-Truiden, whom I will tell more about later, came to visit me. He took off my boots and trousers, cleaned them a bit, and reported to the captain. He took my coat and had me transferred to the hospital in Parnisch-Krone. Thus, I left my regiment without knowing where it was headed. I was taken alone by a farmer to the mentioned town. Upon my arrival at the hospital in Parnisch-Krone, I was told that the surgeons had left the day before. Nevertheless, I was allowed to stay. After a stay of 8 days, it became clear that we were not receiving any medicines or care. Therefore, I asked 6 or 7 cuirassiers who were also staying there to go with me to the local commander to request wagons for us. This would allow us to go to the hospital in Stettin, changing wagons in each city along the way. We were 80 hours of walking, 400 kilometers, from Stettin, where the nearest hospital was located. The commander immediately granted our request, as he was glad to be rid of us. The next day, 8 of us were taken on 2 wagons to Deutsch-Krone. Upon our arrival there, I was quartered with one of the cuirassiers, while the others were accommodated in an inn. The next day, we went to the mayor to ask for wagons. But he said he didn't know where they were. By talking nicely, we still managed to get a wagon. We left without knowing which way to go, as the others had taken the marching orders. So we rode on an open wagon, while it rained from morning until evening, and my companion did not share a piece of his cloak with me to keep me dry. We followed the road to a town that, according to the mayor, was in the direction of Stettin. Upon our arrival there, we each were assigned separate lodgings. The next day, I went out alone and left the unhelpful cuirassier behind in his lodging. He was much worse off than I was because he spoke no German and I did. After a lonely journey of 4 days, I arrived in Nieuwedel, where I stepped into the mayor's office for a lodging certificate. What was my surprise to find the chief surgeon of our regiment there. After I told him where I had come from and where I was going, he assigned me a lodging where I could stay for a longer period. He informed me that the companies were quartered in villages in the surrounding area and that the city was full of sick people. When I reached my lodging, I was fortunate to find very kind, though very poor, people. That they were poor did not bother me, as I received a good, clean bed and needed nothing more than a bit of herbal tea. I went straight to bed, but the next morning I could not get up. Day by day, my health deteriorated. Every day I heard the salvos when another soldier from our regiment was buried, but initially, I still had good hopes for recovery. On the 14th day of my illness, I heard some shots again. I asked a comrade who visited me, which happened rarely, who was being buried. He told me it was a quartermaster sergeant from our company named Ganards, the brother of the quartermaster. I knew him very well, and it saddened me deeply because he was a brave soldier. I replied, "Today they shoot for him, and maybe tomorrow for me, that's how it goes." He comforted me as best he could and then left. The next day I was in much worse condition than before, and I asked my host for pen and paper to write my own death notice. I got them, but I was so weak that I fainted and showed no signs of life for 24 hours. This concludes the first part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes.